Okay, welcome to another video in the A to Z of writing language learning materials. Today it's a great honor to invite Jeremy Harmer. Jeremy, in two or three sentences, when somebody says, "Who are you? What do you do?" How do you normally answer?
Well, I'm a teacher of English. That's how I started. And most of my career at the beginning was in Mexico, well, International House and then Mexico, where I started writing, and I'll tell you about that in a minute, and teacher training. And then my career morphed into being more of a writer uh, than anything else. And that's been certainly the last few years.
I started teaching in 1992, and that was I actually came across your writing as soon as I started on what was a certificate.
And I started teaching 20 years earlier than you. So I went to Mexico to teach. Then I came back to Britain and taught in Britain for a bit, where I did a master's in applied linguistics, which scrambled my brain completely because I was suddenly reading all this academic stuff and things like that. And I went back to Mexico, uh, where I started training teachers for the first time properly. Um, but my head was scrambled with all this academic stuff. Plus, my first daughter had just been born, so my head was further scrambled by that. And my trainees in Mexico just couldn't understand what I was talking about. Um, I confused them, and it was my problem then because I hadn't quite absorbed what I needed to say. So what I did is I produced sort of notes as kind of follow-ups to the input sessions. And what I discovered, and I don't know whether you would speak to this as a writer yourself, um, is that I was rather better at explaining myself in writing than I had been in the live input sessions. And the trainees found them incredibly useful. And that's how this came about. It was because of that that I got in touch with a publisher, and the publishers heard about me, and I wrote this. So that's the sort of story of how I did it.
Yeah, what I would say is I think, and it's true for teacher training or giving presentations or whatever it is, I find it really helpful to write a summary or an article of whatever it is I'm going to be doing in the training or the presentation. And I generally try to do it beforehand, sometimes because I get asked to write a summary afterwards anyway. But also, I find that writing process and structuring it in written form helps me get clear in my head what it is I'm trying to actually say. And that writing process and the presenting and the training process all ties in. And I think this is where teacher training becomes so important, that experience of teacher training and also observing teachers all over the place. Like you, I've been sort of lucky enough to observe teachers in every type of context. I've seen teachers use my materials that I've written in ways that I just hadn't expected. And you
Yeah.
get that kind of exposure that just means that in terms of training other teachers, it's not the same as sort of delivering your own agenda. It's sort of accepting that there are many different ways in which people work, and knowing how that sort of feeds into your writing, I think.
I don't know how you'd feel about this, but my view about being a methodology writer and a coursebook writer, though I've spent more time, well, I don't know about spending more time, but in my heart, I feel more of a methodology writer than a coursebook writer, as it were. Um, is is that everything you write? I'll backtrack a bit. When you're writing classroom material, you start in your head subconsciously. You're sort of thinking of classrooms that you've taught in and what they look like. It seems to me, and if you stay there, you won't produce something necessarily that's particularly useful to people, I think. So that it's only when you say, yeah, well, that's the kind of classroom I'm used to, but I do know, and rather like you, because we've seen classes in so many different places, I do know there are other classrooms. So, and how about if the person who got hold of this material doesn't think like me? They're rather different. What would they do? How can I write material that most people would kind of get and be able to work with, rather than the kind of material that I get and would like to work with? And it's that kind of it's not. I was going to say making a leap. That's too bigger word for it. It's that kind of making a slight shift in your thinking to look, these aren't going to be people, the people using this material aren't going to be me, and they aren't going to be my colleagues where I work. They're going to be people maybe somewhere else entirely. So I have to write with them in mind as well as my own personal kind of situation in mind. And I think that's quite a big step for a writer, don't you?
Yeah, and it's one of the things when we run our training courses in materials writing, it's that thing that lots of people kind of struggle with because you feel kind of quite invested in the experience you've built up, and
Yes.
you believe there are okay, there are many ways to do things, but there's certain things you just believe or assumptions you make, and then suddenly if you're asked to write for other teachers, or you're trying to get your work published so it'll be used by people in different parts of the world, it's very difficult to change that mindset. And I think it's quite interesting if we focus on methodology, how we present methodology in a way that it would be very easy to say, hi guys, here's the correct methodology, and this is what I'm promoting. And there are writers that do that. There are very writers who have very set opinions on this is the methodology you should all be using. Um, Whereas there's a different sort of methodology writing, which is more, this is kind of more reporting, this is what different people are doing, this is what's out there, which a book like this that you wrote is much more doing that, isn't it?
My close friend Scott Thornbury, in some ways, is often able to be much more polemical than I am. It depends what he's writing, of course. Um, but my own feeling about a general methodology book, a book that people will find useful, is to say, look, here's the big picture, and here are some of the. So, for example, if you're writing about pair work and group work, you say, well, pair work's good for this. On the other hand, group work's good for that. And but essentially, you're not saying use this rather than that.
Yeah.
If you're talking about, which you're bound to do in a general methodology book, um, uh, different kind of approaches to teaching, uh, communicative language teaching, task-based learning, you have to be able to say, well, this is more or less what people think it means. Yeah, there's some variation in that. And this is what people who really support it say, and this is what people who aren't so keen say. In other words, I think our role, your role, my role, is to say to people, look, I acknowledge that there are many different ways of doing this. If you're in training and you need a methodology book, or if you read the methodology books that we both write and other people write, it's really a question of what you want from them. And I would love to write more polemical things and get more excited and say, you got to do it this way. And but actually that's not kind of my mindset in a way. My mindset is this is an extraordinarily uh, um, varied profession, and there are so many ways of getting to the same place, just as there are so many individual students who get to slightly different places, but in different ways. That somehow the role of a methodology writer, it seems to me, is to take account of that.
It's a tricky balance because you know that if your writing is going to be read by somebody who's just starting out in teaching, they're actually looking for single ways to do things initially,
Yeah.
just to, in order to survive, get through, do it, and they're looking for do it this way. It's what I would say, sort of methodology with imperatives as opposed to
Yeah.
methodology with modals, which is more, well, you might do it that way or you might do it that way, and it's got kind of if clauses and stuff because it's giving you these different options in this sense of it's okay to experiment, which is kind of what you want a more experienced teacher to start doing and start questioning what they've received earlier on. So you've got to pitch your writing there. In terms of, I'm always interested in the relationship between particularly ELT methodology writing and more academic writing. How do you see that relationship between you writing for methodology and teachers in classrooms compared to writing something that would be perhaps something more academic?
You know perfectly well, as many of the people who watch this will know, that there is a sort of tension between the academic writing about language teaching and the more practical based writing about language teaching. Indeed, some people argue passionately that, theory has nothing to offer teachers, day-to-day teachers, because theorists all live in academic ivory towers and so on and so forth. I fundamentally reject that point of view. I think anyone who's interested in trying to work out how people learn better and why people learn, wherever they're coming from, are people I want to listen to. Now, there's a very good book called How Languages Are Learned by Lightbound and Spada, and their latest edition was it's probably pre-lockdown, I think. And they said that teachers often get frustrated when they read academic stuff because they find that, Hughes disagrees with Harmer or whoever it is. The experts, theorists often disagree. But part of the joy of our profession is precisely that people disagree. So, do I think theory should guide language teaching? No. But do I think language teaching should take account of theory as far as it's possible? Yes. And I've always seen my role as a methodology writer of trying to be more or less current with what people are saying, and then, as it were, translate that into kind of guidance for teachers. I think what teachers, the lived experience of teachers and what they learn and what they discover and the kind of ongoing research that a teacher does as they teach is absolutely vital to their understanding of what they do. But why not go and have a look at what other people who focus specifically on an issue about classroom this or classroom that, read that, and then compare it with their own kind of lived experience and see how they feel. Because not all theorists are correct. Well, neither are teachers if it comes to that. So I think the interface between the two is fascinating, and I've never been able to understand. And there's one or two other methodology writers who are in that position. I've never been able to quite understand people who say, "Oh, I'm not going to listen to theory. It's all about the lived experience." That's just not true. The lived experience is vitally important, but then so are what people are trying to say and help us to believe about it. So I've always thought of my writing as a kind of, you've got all the theory up there and the lived experience down here. And my writing is an attempt to kind of go somewhere in the middle of those two, I think.
When you started out, who were the methodology writers that you turned to? Who did you pick up and read and think, yeah, I get this?
It was around the time of there was a really good sort of methodology book of the type we're talking about called Teaching Oral English by Don Byrne, a big figure of those days, but very much feet in the classroom, not in the clouds sort of thing. It was this sort of not exactly when I started, but it was all that age of there was sort of Earl Stevick way and ways. There was just as I started, Krashen sort of came up and started talking about acquisition and learning. But the other thing that had happened in the 1970s was the kind of sudden outburst of the communicative approach. That was a big on the one hand, which was sort of all about how you teach and on this side of it. But there was also, and I did my master's at Reading University in the days of David Wilkins, and he'd written a book called Notional Syllabuses in 1976, or it was published in 76, which is why I went to Reading a few years later, because I wanted to go and sit at his feet, if you see what I mean. And this whole discussion about language functions and that language isn't just grammar and so on and so forth. It's also functional. So you have the kind of functional language and use side of the communicative approach, and the kind of what we do in the classroom kind of take on communicative approach. And that was feeding into my thinking then. Um, but I also, on that master's, was lectured by the best lecturer I've had in my educational studying, a man called David Crystal, who will be familiar to many of you, who simply gave us after lunch lectures about the structure of English based on the University Grammar of English. So I was really fortunate. I had this sort of wonderful smorgasbord of different influences. But as I say, when I went back to Mexico and started teaching and training there, I hadn't yet unscrambled a lot of the more linguistic-y and theoretical and socio-cultural stuff. You need time to digest it. But those were the kind of influences, I think, at the time.
Did you find a distinction between writers who tend to be what I call the sort of the third person writers, or the writers that use you and he and she, and then there's the writers that write I, and they're very much from a personal perspective? Were you drawn to either type of writer? There's the sort of personality methodology writers, aren't there? And then there's the more bigger picture type methodology writers.
I've mentioned Scott Thornbury before, and he did a talk a few years ago uh, at the IATEFL conference, and it was all based on interviewing Doug Brown, Penny Eyre, Jim Scrivener, and myself, and he was trying to tease out what we did and how we did it and all this kind of stuff. We were asked to sort of say what we thought was special about us, not in a self-aggrandizing way, but just he was trying to sort of tease out what it is that methodology writers think. And we all said, um, which is quite funny because we've got very different voices uh, uh, on the page, but we all said independently of each other, "Oh, it's my voice. I have a writing voice. What do I think of the voices of the others? Well, I think they're all brilliant. Otherwise, people wouldn't rely on them so much." Um, but Jim Scrivener comes over as much more kind of, he's a very different voice from mine. Penny again is a much more uh, down to earth kind of voice from mine. From my own point of view, and forgive me for being so sort of self-referential here. Uh, I'm not so good on the you and the I, but I use the pronoun we a lot.
Mm.
Tend to think that as teachers, what we often do is, it took me a bit of time to notice that I was doing that, um, and I think it's my attempt to emphasize the fact that whether it's you working with materials writers or writing course book material, or we're part of a big we. So I like to use we, saying, look, we tend to do this, although it might not be appropriate in certain circumstances, blah, 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 blah. I think that's what I would say to that.
Yeah, it was interesting because I was flicking through your book and I was wondering what answer you were going to give to that question, because you can look at people's writing and sort of identify that kind of writing style. And clearly, somebody writing, Robert McClarty, who edits Modern English Teacher, good friend, is often looking for articles, and he gets quite different articles from, you may have a teacher that's quite inexperienced but come up with a really good idea, shares the idea, and it's very much this is I from my perspective, and that's the sort of starting out voice in methodology. And then with more experience, it's sort of more of a global picture, because it's more of a sort of a we, and you've seen people from different places. And also when you work with teachers from different contexts, it seems incredibly presumptuous to turn up with a way of sort of saying, well, you need to do it like this, because how could I possibly comment on that? I don't know enough. All I can do is offer. It's a sort of a cross-cultural approach, isn't it? You're presenting, well, this is what we do here. What do you think? Hand it over, find out. It's that kind of approach, which is quite different.
I think you absolutely hit the nail on the head. I mean, human beings learn stuff and they go about it in different ways, which brings us back to an earlier part of the discussion. But yeah.
it does make, for example, your job, if you're in the situation of writing a methodology book like this, it's going to cover lots of things. How do you decide what you're going to keep in and what doesn't make the grade? Because
I can't resist doing this.
that's a real judgment call on
I
you.
can't resist doing this. This is these are oh, wait a minute. These are all editions of the same book, except they're very different books. But this was the first one. The
Yeah,
one that you pulled out was the fourth one.
yeah.
That's the blue one, and then the most recent one was 2015. That's the green one, and in between, then there were, well, it must have been two others because we've just done three. Um, I went to a talk some years ago, but I think probably about 2016, um, by a man called Sean Wilden, who you know, and many of the people watching this will know. And without my, he hadn't asked me or anything, but he actually just put up the contents pages from all five editions and said, look at some of the shifts and the changes through this. I am profoundly privileged to have been allowed to do five editions of the same book, because it's been the best thing ever. Because if you go back to the one which I keep showing around, the 1983 one, not all of it is gone in the fifth edition, but things were far more limited here. But it shifted over the time. Now, what's changed? Well, the understanding of what the communicative approach was all about, and the effect it's had has shifted over those five editions, number one. Number two, a major issue has been things like learner preferences and learner styles, which kind of came massively into focus. And so what the ELT profession did, which we do so well or badly, depending on your point of view, is it came in from, stuff like multiple intelligences and neuro-linguistic programming. And all this came in from outside ELT, nothing to do with ELT. And what does ELT do? We kind of grab onto it with both hands and bring it into the profession. So in earlier editions, I was kind of honor bound to mention it. Because everyone else was mentioning it, and if you wanted to understand, and it was in exam syllabuses and all sorts of things. But then recently, that's had people have looked at it more carefully, and people like Carol Leatherby and Patty Harris and Russell Main have said, look, come on, guys, where's the evidence? And if there's no evidence for anything, you can't say this is the way to teach. Same with the whole crash and acquisition and learning thing. It doesn't stack up in the way that we thought might be. It did at the beginning. So all of that sort of shifts and changes over the editions. The big one, question mark, I think, the big one, of course, is what we have available as teachers, the technology we have available. And that's really interesting as I start writing methodology again, partly because of what happened in 2020 and the way that an awful lot of language learning went online in a flash. And the other thing, of course, is to, the landscape has been massively transformed by what's happening with artificial intelligence and so on. So, and in the writing I'm doing at the moment, that has to be reflected, because it's a game changer. But, and I'll finish this answer because I've been going on for a long time. But the real question is, what principles here hold true?
I was thinking while talking, because we get material writers and teachers who write materials watching this. We also get editors. And editing a methodology book is not the same as editing a course book. And I thought you must have worked with a lot of methodology editors. What makes a good methodology editor?
I've been privileged to work with some really good editors. One in particular who first edited my methodology writing many years ago and continued right up until the 2015 edition, a woman called Helena Gong. Why was she so good? Well, what makes a good methodology editor is they have to understand who they're editing, and you have to understand who your editor is. It's all about relationships, I think. Now, in the case of Helena, she's very professionally good at what she does. So she's very good at saying, I don't understand. What do you mean here? This doesn't stack up because you said 2 pages ago this. Or might it be better to say it this way? Or are you really saying that? What exactly are you trying to say? So I think one of the qualities is being completely unafraid to challenge, to provoke. But what I would, and it works very well because she seems to have had some respect for me as a writer, and I have massive respect for her as an editor. And that's what I mean about the relationship. I don't know how you feel about this because you must have been edited by quite a few people, but the relationship is crucial. You can edit and destroy. You can edit and the editor. I've worked with one or two editors who it's just not been a productive relationship at all. What you need is someone who will challenge you, but challenge you with questions. A really good methodology editor says, I can't really see my way through this. What are you trying to say? Or I'm not sure I would agree. Is there any other way you can put this? Am I making, does this make sense, anything of what I'm saying? I'm sure it's about the relationship and what they see as their best way of provoking you to rethink or go further. I think something like that.
It's quite a tough job because it's a balance. I think that ability to ask questions is crucial. And I've worked with Helena, and the other person I've worked a lot with is Penny Hands, and it's that thing of just asking the right question at the right moment
Yeah.
to think, oh, so you have to recap and think, maybe I need to do it other way. Or sometimes it is, yes, you said X 2 pages ago, you seem to be contradicting yourself or whatever. And sometimes the question can be quite basic, but there's questions which require them to have quite a high understanding of what it is you're working. So it's quite a multifaceted job, and it's tough. And relationship obviously is important. I think that's true with any editor writer relationship, but methodology is particular. It's quite personal, yeah, sometimes.
Yes, and you've added something that I didn't say, which is of course part of the deal, which is they have to know what they're talking about as well. I mean, they don't have to be experts in ELT methodology, but they have to know enough to be in there. I think, yeah.
Yeah, and also they're coming at it, it's being written for, people, teachers, other people with methodology background who are going to come at it with a certain sort of level of knowledge and understanding, and they need to come at it in the same way because it's got to be written to reach those people.
I got
Yeah.
a question for you. How do you react when you get some feedback, which is quite challenging? What
Well,
sort of
first of all, I don't respond straight away. I leave it till the following day because I know that I need a night to digest. Otherwise, I'll fire off an email and upset somebody or something, or I'll instantly think, okay, I need to rewrite it all. Then I do a rewrite, and then the next day I regret having done the rewrite, and I think actually I should have stood my ground more over this because it required it. So leaving a night between it, a lot is to do with relationship, whether you've worked with the editor before, do you know how they work? I remember Helena, I'd worked with her on a few books, and then the more I worked with her, the more direct she might be. Well, certain things she might have said to me, if it had been somebody else, they might have riled me more, and I might have got a bit sort of done that classic writer thing, and you just want to write an email back and say, well, was there anything you actually liked? Because you get that editor who's got used to working with this, so they don't even bother to say, oh, that bit's really good. They go straight into, we need to fix this and this. And sometimes writers can be a bit overly sensitive, and we think, well, we want to hear that you like something about it, and obviously editors need to remember it. So it comes back to that communication and relationship.
You say at 24 hours. I have 48 hours of being incredibly hurt, sort of upset. And how? No, you were. But like you, we obviously have the same thing, which is wait, just wait, get over it, and then for me, it's a kind of three-stage process. I may just be repeating what you said. Number one is I'm sorry. It's now 48, 2 or 3 days later. I've read what you do. I don't agree. Tough. It's staying in. The second one is, yeah, okay. Yes, I agree. It's not quite clear. How can I do this to get round that? What can I do to sort of get round it and make it work and stuff like that? And the third one is just the one where, oh my God, she's right, or he's right. It's rubbish, and you just throw it away. But my own feeling, and this I'd say to anyone who's a writer, I suppose of any kind of writing, because I've had fiction editing as well. My own feeling about all this is in the end, it's my favorite part of the whole process in a way, because it's a really, you do it all in your own head because you can't ring up the editor every 2 seconds and say, what did you mean? So it's all happening in your own head, but it's profoundly creative, that moment of you're having this kind of internal kind of dialogue and argument and battle in your own head. I absolutely love that section. It's
I
wonderful.
was recently reading Hanif Kuresh's book Shattered about he's can't move and has all sorts of struggles, but he talks about writing. He talks about the importance of friction in writing and that you can't write without friction. And he talks about friction in different ways. And I think that a lot of friction can come from a good editor, and it can be real positive friction to introduce. Last question, because we're running out of time. If I'm a teacher with a couple of years experience, creative, got ideas in the classroom, and I want to start, I don't know, blogging, sending an article, writing a little bit, maybe something practical, but something with a bit of methodology, what would be maybe your advice to your earlier self or to that teacher?
I think the first thing is sit back and then try and be as dispassionate as possible and write it and see what happens. And when you've done that, you show it to someone who's, well, show it to two people if you like. I mean, metaphorically, two people. One, a sort of buddy who you get on with, because hopefully they can give you some friendly encouragement. And two, show it to someone who probably doesn't quite share the way you see things and see what they say. Mm-hmm. Always in the understanding that you're not asking them to say, please tell me this is brilliant or should I publish it? But it's just, and until someone's eyes have seen it, everyone says about good writers, I'm not talking about methodology or anything, but just good writers, is until you can reach some objectivity about the text you've just written, you're in danger of disappearing in yourself. So get some feedback and then try it out with someone else, and then they'll end up doing everything that you've been talking about and I've been talking about in this conversation, especially the whole editing discussion. In other words, try and write it down as dispassionately as possible. And I will go back, as I finish, to the very beginning of this conversation, which is imagine the classroom in your mind and then try and imagine a classroom on the other side of the world, or not necessarily on the other side of the world, but on the other side of the city, or on, and see if it seems to work when you have that in your head, and then show it to someone, and preferably sort of angel and devil kind of thing. I mean, not devil, but you know what I mean.
I know what you mean.
That would be my advice.
Just to add to that, because you said while you were talking, it reminded me of something at the beginning. We talked about the relationship between writing up something and writing up, say, a presentation. I once wrote something for Tessa Woodward, and who is the editor of the Teacher Trainer Journal, and she sent it back, and she wasn't very happy with the piece I'd said, and said, "Have you stood up and tried reading this aloud as though you're explaining it to a group of teachers?" That piece of advice has always stuck with me, this idea that once you've written your article, you could sort of stand up, read it aloud. How does it sound? But also, if you were reading it to somebody, would they be following you? What would their reaction be? And it's a really nice kind of, it's almost like a visualization technique, but
just brilliant. And for me, as I said, it was because I wasn't making much sense
Mm.
speaking that I learned how to be a methodology writer, because something different happened when I was sitting there trying to say, well, you're going to be reading this on your own. It's got to be much clearer than me waffling away.
Which is a really nice place to stop because we've come full circle to the beginning. Jeremy, thank you very much for talking to me. It's been really great to be able to talk about methodology in the writing process.
Well, thank you, and I've enjoyed this conversation because there's nothing we like as writers more than talking about writing, but also because I've enjoyed many of the things you've said about it as well, because I recognize them completely. It's been great.